Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and today we are doing a life practice episode, and we are going to be doing an introduction to your mind. Now, that might sound kind of a strange way to put it, but a lot of us are not really aware of exactly how our minds work, and this is going to be kind of a key issue for us because at Kinship Cafe, we're very concerned about this idea of well-being. And if we're looking for how are we going to achieve well-being, how are we going to get there, then what we're really talking about is that we're going to need to do some change. But a lot of us don't know how to do that. I know that for a lot of us, we just struggle with this, especially, like trying to, with our diets or other types of habits that we want to implement, and we use our willpower, and it just doesn't seem to be enough, and we get frustrated and we give up. So part of what I'm hoping we can do today is help us to understand a little bit more about how our minds work so that we can work with them instead of against them. And this is going to help us to be able to achieve those kinds of goals that we set for ourselves, especially as they relate to well-being. So with that in mind, I want to just cover some basic topics today. We're not going to go super in-depth, but hopefully enough that you get a sense of how these things work together so that at least to the degree that we can then use that information in looking at how we implement change for ourselves. The first thing that we really want to understand about our mind is it's really made up of a collection, if you will, of brains. We are not simply a solo brain in terms of making all the decisions and how things work. There's really four main parts that we could look at as different brains that sometimes are at competing commitments with each other. And so understanding how these work together is going to be crucial for us to be able to look at understanding and how do we make changes in our lives. So let's look at what each of these four are. We'll start with the first, and this is really the oldest part of the brain. This is the part from an evolutionary perspective that's been around the longest, and it's going to be the unconscious part of things. It's what regulates all the stuff that's going on in your body without you having to think about it. It's your heart rate. When you think about how you get around in the world, the walking, you don't have to really think about everything that you're doing with your feet and your legs and your arms and your whole body. I mean, the amount of things that go on to navigate that level of balance is just phenomenal. I mean, the trigonometry involved is just unbelievable. And all of that is happening at a pre-conscious level. At the same time, one of the key things, too, that's different with this part of the brain is it's multiprocessor in a sense that it can handle multiple things simultaneously. Later, when we talk about the conscious part of our brain, we can really only focus on one thing at a time. It's very linear in terms of how we understand and think about things. The unconscious brain can deal with multiple things simultaneously. And that really makes it very powerful, very strong. The other part of it is the whole stream of information from the input that's coming in from our senses and from inside our body, and all this is traveling through, in a sense, kind of a pre-processor that the unconscious part of the brain, the old brain, has access to. And if it recognizes certain patterns that correlate to things that it understands as either problems or emergencies or whatever, it can actually act on those things before we're even aware of it. So if you've ever been like out in the yard and jumped and you realize, you look down, oh, that was just a hose, that was the unconscious part of your brain that recognized that pattern that looked like a snake and made you jump out of the way before you were even aware of what it was that you were doing. And of course there's great benefit to this because that's going to keep you alive. It's just a little bit longer, maybe a second to maybe a second and a half longer that it would have taken if you had to go through the processing of becoming consciously aware of what it was, understanding what to do about it, and then making a decision to move. Is quite a bit longer than maybe the 1/10 of a second that the unconscious part of the brain can process that and make you get out of the way. And that's why that happens. But it's key to know that this is happening pre-consciously. So that's the old brain and how it functions roughly. The next part of it we'll call the new brain, and this is going to be where consciousness comes into the picture. And this is, again, only able to focus on one thing at a time, so it's very sequential, linear in how it's able to function. And so in that sense, it's not quite as strong in some capacities as we might think of as the old brain in terms of processing power. But obviously, it allows for some really novel things, such as being able to plan for the future, predict things, look back and recognize the past, whereas the old brain is very much managed by input that's happening at the moment. Is this good? Is this bad? Go forward, go back. It's pretty much in the moment type of an idea, whereas the conscious brain can then extrapolate out into thinking about the bigger picture, bringing in questions about morality and ethics and things that the older brain just has no awareness of. But it's not simply that there's this newer part of the brain where the consciousness is. It's really kind of unique because it's divided into two hemispheres. So we've got the old brain, which is going to be kind of what we think of as the first of the four. And then we've got the left and the right hemispheres of our new brain, which is going to be the second and third brains that we're talking about. Now, what's interesting with this is that we tend to specialize and have different functions that we do in each side of the brain. But what's really kind of a mystery, and nobody's quite sure why, is that we control the opposite side of the body and features from the hemisphere that's responsible for it. So the left hemisphere of the brain is actually controlling the right side of the body, and then vice versa. Now, we've been able to learn some really interesting things about how this, in a sense, division of labor happens when we have looked at patients where they've had to have the connection between the two sides severed, cut. And normally, this would happen intentionally as part of an operation. At one point, they were looking at people who were suffering from pretty serious seizures, and that if they were to sever the connection between the two hemispheres, it would stop it from taking over the whole brain, and it would really lessen the impact of the seizure. So for patients who went through this process, they were still able to function, but there were some interesting little side effects, and the tests that they were able to do with that really have added to our understanding of what's going on with either side of the brain. So one of the things that we've discovered is that the language center is pretty much in the left side. So if you were to show something to the eye that was affecting the right brain, so this would be the left eye, in such a way that the other eye couldn't see what it was, and you asked the person what they saw, they wouldn't be able to tell you. But if it was on a card and you had different cards laid out with different shapes on it, and you asked them to point with their left hand to the image that they saw, they could do it. So the information was there, it just didn't have a way of being able to express it through language. Now, what's interesting is what would happen in terms of the conscious awareness of what the person was doing and why. There's another interesting part that we see about how people think about what it is that they're doing when they are acting on something that was done with the part of the brain that doesn't have the language part of it. So if you were to show a command to that left eye, say walk, what would happen is the patient would get up and walk. And they would ask the patient, what are you doing? And they would say, oh, I'm getting up to get a Coke. They didn't have a conscious awareness of the fact that they saw this card that said walk. But what happened is their brain still needed to make sense out of it. And so there's an aspect of this conscious side of it that's trying to string together this narrative that makes sense of what you are doing, even if it's after the fact. And so this process is what they call confabulation. And it's where you're not consciously aware of the fact that you've just invented a story, but in fact you have just invented a story to help make sense out of the facts of you getting up and starting to walk for seemingly no reason, because the left side of the brain wasn't aware of what the right side had seen. Very fascinating. That aspect of confabulation is going to come back to us over and over again as we look at different aspects of our brain and how we look about making change as we go forward. Right now, just kind of be aware of that process and what's going on with it. The fourth brain that we just want to talk about real quick is actually in the gut. In fact, your intestines have over 100 million neurons. I mean, it's doing a pretty amazing job of handling that whole digestion process and how it breaks down food and starts that whole cycle of getting energy out of those nutrients. But it also regulates other things. So trying to deal with issues of disease or foreign substances or other things that create, uncomfortable situations for us where sometimes we might need to go to the bathroom rather rapidly or maybe without even our control. The other thing that will happen sometimes is if it detects some kind of inflammation, it can even create a sense of anxiety in our mind, right? I mean, it actually has an impact on what's going on. There's a whole new kind of emerging science right now that's looking at the impact of your gut bacteria and how this impacts different aspects of your mood, of your cravings, of your desires. You can even think of just some simple things like, how does your attitude change when you haven't had enough to eat or you haven't had your morning coffee, let's say, right? I mean, it's things that start to have an impact on your personality based off of stuff that's happening in your guts. I mean, it's crazy, but there's so much more that's going on, and even that idea of emotions or even that sense of dread or anxiety that can sometimes feel like it's really, coming from our guts. In a certain sense, it may be. So we've got kind of these different areas. We've got the old brain, we've got the left and right part of the new brain, and we've got our gut brain, and they kind of all have their own agendas, so to speak, and they're kind of vying for power, vying for dominance. And it's not always that we're aware that this is going on, because for us it just seems like, well, there's this conscious part, this ongoing narrative part that we think is us and that is in control, but in reality there's a lot of other stuff going on, and sometimes we're not in control, at least the conscious part. It's all us. The unconscious brain, the gut brain, that's all still us. It's just working in ways that we're not always aware of because it's not immediately obvious. But as we'll see, it's going to have a big impact on how we can actually affect change. The other thing we want to kind of understand is the relationship between emotions and reason. Now, I grew up watching Star Trek, the original, with Spock and Kirk. And of course, Spock was the intellectual. He was reason. He was, all the stuff that we were thinking we wanted to try and be. And Kirk was kind of the hothead. He ruled by his emotions and making sometimes, what we might think of as foolish decisions. And I came away from that as a young person thinking, we really need to work on becoming more logical, more rational, and getting rid of the emotions or putting them at bay. But what we've seen is in patients who have had injuries to their brains that essentially disable their ability to have emotions. I mean, they're still there, they're still able to function, with one crucial exception. They can't make decisions. And this is just a fascinating thing, or at least it was to me when I first learned about this. The emotions part of how our brain functions is really crucial for how we actually decide anything. And it really boils down to kind of this real basic kind of a system that sometimes is referred to as avoidance and approach systems, that's basically like or dislike, that's kind of always running, and they're kind of, you could think about how strong each signal is, maybe in terms of yes, no. And depending on which one gets dominance, that's going to be the thing that kind of tips the scale inside of one way or the other, and we either move forward or we don't. And that's the emotion part that really brings that in. So the reason and the rationality really works with the emotions, and they kind of work together in a much more complicated way, where it's not simply we need to get rid of emotions or suppress our emotions. We need to understand how they work, and that they're very important for how we learn as well as how we make decisions. One final thing while we're doing this kind of big overview, and that is this idea of judgments. How do we judge something? And I'm thinking of this in particular because I'm also very aware of the kind of challenges we're having in our society right now with being able to make decisions or find ways of getting along, especially like in the political climate. It seems like there's such a stalemate right now. And what I've been learning about how this whole judgment process works really, I think, is a key to helping us get a better sense on how we might be able to move forward in this area of understanding each other, understanding where we're coming from and how we got there for our particular positions on things. So what's interesting with the issue of judgments, something will come up that we have to make a decision about. Are we for this or are we against this kind of a thing? And you would think that we click into this rational process and we start weighing out these pros and cons. And what they're finding is that's not exactly what happens. We usually have some kind of gut reaction to whatever it is, and then we kind of look at what information we do have until it confirms why that makes sense, and then we kind of stop. So as soon as we get enough information, we're like, okay, well, that makes sense of what I was feeling, then the thinking process kind of stops. However, we will still have, in the same way this confabulation would work for trying to explain why the guy got up to go get a Coke, it'll kind of be a similar process that goes into play to explain why are we holding on to this position. And it's not necessarily going to be that we had this gut reaction. It could be a much more elaborate kind of a story that gets made up to explain the reality of us making that decision. The reason this is important, one, we are not aware of the fact that we've just done that, but two, if we're in conversation with somebody and they're coming from a different perspective and they hear our argument, our justification for why we made that judgment, and they are able to kind of take apart the rationality of that judgment and demonstrate that that doesn't really make sense, we may find that we still hold on to our position because that argument that they just deconstructed wasn't really the reason that we held to that position. It was that intuitive gut reaction that we moved us to hold that position. We just kind of came up with this story to explain why we thought that was important. So when we're getting into these discussions and kind of taking apart each other's rationality for, their particular perspective, and it doesn't seem to be having any kind of impact, this is maybe part of what's going on. Now, it's not to say that we never have situations where we actually do the research, and if somebody's really disciplined and very aware of how we make those mistakes, then that's a whole nother story, and we might really listen to what other people are saying, but we have to really be intentional about that. Just kind of the general reaction of how we go about our lives, if we're not really thinking about it, is we have these intuitions, these gut reactions to things that make this judgment for us. We come up with reasons why, and whether or not those reasons hold up in other people's opinions or how they hold up in public opinion doesn't really change that underlying reason we made that judgment. It's just one of those things that, again, in future episodes, we'll probably come back around to this because I think it's really important in how we think about the process of why we're doing the things that we're doing. And if we want to make change, how do we understand better why we're doing those things and navigate that? Okay, so basic overview then, we've got not just one mind, but we've got a mind that's made up of like 4 brains that maybe are not all trying to accomplish the same thing, and that they have different skill sets, if you will, division of labor that we need to be aware of. We've got emotions and how they function with reason in terms of making decisions, and then we've got this process of judgment and confabulation where we have to be aware of the fact that we tend to make up stories to explain why we did the things we did, maybe even before we were conscious of doing them. So with that background then, how do we go about thinking about change? Well, the first thing is we need maybe a little bit easier way of thinking about our brain. Even though what I just explained is extremely basic. I mean, we did not dive deep on this at all. It can still be a little bit unwieldy. It's kind of hard to get a handle on or how we might use it. So we need a good metaphor for how we can think about the brain and how it works. And I really like this metaphor that Jonathan Haidt came up with. He wrote a book, The Happiness Hypothesis, that pulls together a lot of this information in a way that I found very accessible. There's a lot of great books out here on this, but he had a metaphor that just immediately kind of captured me. I know it did for him as well. And it's this idea that the older part of the brain, that pre-conscious, powerful part of it, he likes to envision that as an elephant. And that the conscious part is like a little human rider on top of the elephant. And that conscious part, we can kind of lean or push or pull on that elephant to kind of get it to go one way or the other. And if the elephant doesn't have anything else going on at the moment, then he's fine to go along. But if the elephant's interested in doing something different, our little yanking and pulling isn't going to make any difference. We can go head to head with the elephant, but the elephant's going to win. Our willpower as that conscious side is just no match, and it's going to wear out really quickly. So when we think about willpower, as a way to try and change things, this is where it sometimes comes up so wanting, because it's just no match for the elephant. And the more we can kind of be aware of the fact that we have this elephant, this powerful, huge, super important and completely amazing elephant, the control part of it that we think of as the rider is we've got to be more creative. We've got to figure out how can we tame this elephant or trick it or find some way to train it in order to be successful at reaching the types of goals, transformation, well-being that we're looking for. So how do we do that? Well, one of them we've talked about previously, and that's mindfulness, or more generally as meditation. Because again, what happens with this amazing tool is it allows us to become more aware of what's actually going on in that moment. Internally, how we're feeling, what we're thinking. Does what we're thinking make sense for what's going on? It gives us kind of that space where we can kind of pause and examine what's going on. We've talked about how we have that interpretation process where, events happen and we interpret those events, and then we're reacting to that interpretation. And we can often confuse that interpretation for the event itself. And part of what we're trying to do is recognize that middle step, that we can pause and try to look more objectively at what actually happened, and more objectively at how we're interpreting it and maybe why. That helps us to have a different response, not just this knee-jerk reaction to the various things that happen in our lives. So all these processes that we're talking about, we gain more insight into them by practicing these simple meditation, mindfulness exercises. And it also helps to train the brain, because the more we do certain things, then the brain starts to kind of wire for it. It starts to kind of physically actually change what it does. When we think about some things that happen and we don't realize they happened, this can sometimes be fairly complex tasks, like maybe driving home from work. And, the elephant isn't born with the ability to know how to drive. But because we've taken the time repeatedly over time to learn how to do the driving, we've kind of built all these neural pathways to understand that process to the point where we don't have to think about it. Like especially if you drive a standard transmission where you have to shift, if you had to really think about everything you were doing with the clutch and the shift and what your RPMs are and all that, it would be very difficult to drive, like it is when you're first learning. But once you've got that down, it's like you don't even think about it. It just happens and you're on your way. Well, when we are driving home, whether it's on automatic or a stick, either way, you may find sometimes that you got home and you don't remember how you got there because you were so caught up either in a conversation or something on the radio. This is that kind of automatic side that kind of took over and did that. Well, that learned behavior of driving became almost kind of like what we might think of as second nature, right? Because now it's there. You don't have to think about it. I know recently I was trying to explain to my kids how to drive a stick shift, and it was hard. I had to really think about what it is I am doing because I just didn't think about it. Same thing if you know how to type without looking, and you can just type and look at the computer screen while you're doing that, which I do that a lot. If somebody asks me where a particular key is on the keyboard, I have to really stop and think about it. I have to kind of like figure out where my fingers are when I hit that key because it's not just there in my mind. It's kind of become like what they'll talk about muscle memory. Same kind of thing. It's that training that happens over time where it becomes just instinctual. It becomes a part of you. And this is part of what we're thinking of when we're taming and training that elephant. And mindfulness is a very powerful way that we can look at moving in that same direction. So I hope this helps to give you a glimpse into some of the unique features of how our minds work and the kinds of things that now that we're aware of them, we can take advantage of as we start to look at different ways of bringing about a greater sense of well-being and how do we bring about personal transformation. As we go into future episodes, now that we've got this under our belt, we'll be able to pull on this wisdom and really develop it further. So I really want to thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you all next time. Be well.